Good afternoon, everyone. I will call the hearing to order and express my gratitude to the witnesses for being here, to Senator Stabenow for being here. Ranking Member Thune is on his way, and if somebody could do something about my volume control, I feel I have to whisper because otherwise I'll blow the doors off the room. That would be a big help. We are here to consider what is going on with enforcement of the political activities of tax-exempt organizations. And I'll make an opening statement, and then if Senator Thune is here, I'll invite him to make an opening statement. If no one is here but Senator Stabenow, I'll invite her to say a few words, and then we'll get on to the witness testimonies. And I want to thank Ms. Ravel, who is here also, but electronically, so she's not in the room with us. 12 years ago, the Supreme Court rested its decision in Citizens United on the false predicate that effective disclosure, their words, effective disclosure, would let voters know who was speaking to them. And that was important because it was the means by which it would dispel corruption. Well, instead, a torrent of dark money, a tsunami of slime, it has been called, washed into our politics. That torrent washed into our politics from behind a veil of organizations formed under Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. Unlike most groups spending money in elections, 501c4 organizations aren't required to disclose their donors. The statute governing these organizations states that they must be operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. But the IRS muddied those waters with a regulation that allowed social welfare organizations to devote up to 49.9% of their spending to political activities and still qualify for 501c4 status. Predictably, these organizations became conduits for the secret political spending that Citizens United said was corrupting. In the decade preceding Citizens United, 501c4 organizations spent $103 million on political expenditures. In the decade following it, they spent over $1 billion. It was a hell of a tsunami. The dark money flowing through the 501c4s got darker. As soon as the IRS sought to review the explosion of these political groups after Citizens United, dark money interests whipped up a scandal, claiming the IRS was unfairly targeting conservative groups for scrutiny. Let's set the record straight. This is false. An exhaustive 2017 report from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration found no such unfair targeting of conservative groups, as did a bipartisan investigation from this very committee. And I ask unanimous consent that the Treasury Inspector General report and the Committee on Finance, the United States Senate report be put into the record here. The damage was nevertheless done. The fake scandal cowed the IRS, and an appropriations rider in place since 2015 blocked the IRS from promulgating regulations to clarify political rules for 501c4 organizations. This means groups flout limits on political activity with little risk to their tax-exempt anonymized status. As early as 2012, a ProPublica investigation found that roughly 3 in 10 of the 501c4 organizations they surveyed reported to the FEC that they had spent money on electioneering, but reported to the IRS that they had spent no money to influence elections, either directly or indirectly. It's hard to see how both statements could be true. A report out last week from the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington describes several recent examples of this problem. One example is the NRA, and I ask unanimous consent that the Crew report I'm referring to be put into the record without objection. Crew says, and I'll quote them here, between 2008 and 2013, the NRA reported to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, that it spent nearly $11 million in independent expenditures out of its 501c4. In 2012, it reported making $7 $7,448,385 in independent expenditures, more than half of which were spent opposing Barack Obama or supporting Mitt Romney in that year's presidential race. Remarkably, the NRA told the IRS under penalty of perjury that it spent absolutely nothing on political campaign activities between 2008 and 2013, nor did it file a Schedule C disclosing details of its political spending. Despite all this open and notorious predication for investigating whether there are false statements made, there's no sign that the IRS is doing much enforcement. A 2018 Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration report estimated that over 1,000 cases of impermissible political activity by 501c4s weren't even forwarded to the agency's committee tasked with recommending audits, despite meeting the IRS criteria. According to a 2020 GAO review, the IRS between 2010 and 2017 conducted only 226 examinations involving impermissible political campaign intervention. Of those, only 6%, a total of 14 examinations, involved 501c4s. That's fewer than 2 per year in the middle of that dark money tsunami. We can't tolerate a system that lets 501c4 groups operate without oversight, not when they spend tens, hundreds, even millions of dollars per election cycle without disclosing their donors. Citizens are denied that most basic right to know what is going on around them in their democracy. First, we should free the IRS to promulgate clear rules for 501c4 organizations, all of them. Second, the IRS should use the tools and resources it already has to crack down on blatant abuse. Lax enforcement sends a message that rules don't matter. Third, referrals need to be made of likely false statements so that the right officials in law enforcement who prosecute false statements as a matter of regular bread and butter can do their jobs and investigate. We are aware of no referrals at all to DOJ despite years of crew, ProPublica, and press reporting of these flagrant discrepancies. I hope that colleagues will join me in untying the IRS's hands and providing it the tools and resources to enforce its most basic rules. The premise of transparency in Citizens United has been violated for far too long. And with that, let me recognize my distinguished ranking member, Senator Thune.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse. It is a pleasure to work with you on this subcommittee. Subcommittee on Tax and IRS Oversight is uniquely positioned to oversee the activities of the Internal Revenue Service, the executive branch agency charged with tax matters. It is my hope that we can use this hearing as a foundation to conduct appropriate oversight of the IRS and ensure that Americans' private tax-related information is protected. Today we're here to discuss the laws and enforcement as they apply to the political activities of tax-exempt entities, and by extension, how those laws and any proposed reforms impact Americans' freedom of speech, association rights, and ability to privately give to caucuses that they care about. Free speech is not just good in theory. It is a key driver of a healthy democracy, and allowing Americans to privately give to causes they care about is a fundamental component of protecting free speech and the First Amendment. Partisan legislation to force tax-exempt groups choose between spreading their message and protecting donors' privacy runs a real and potentially corrosive risk of chilling speech. A few words about the scope, 501c organizations and the IRS. Section 501c of the Internal Revenue Code describes 28 different categories of organizations that generally are exempt from federal income tax. And we're going to focus much of today's discussion around 4 categories. These include 501c3 charitable organizations, 501c4 social welfare organizations, 501c5 labor organizations, and 501c6 trade associations and business leagues. In other words, a wide range of entities that represent diverse constituencies and causes across the country and include churches, charities, nonprofit foundations, advocacy groups, unions, and trade associations. The chairman has a particular interest in 501c4 organizations and their impact on campaigns. And according to a recent New York Times analysis, the impact is anything but small, particularly for politicians on the left. The Times stated that in the last election, the left raised and spent more money from 501c4 donors than the right. The report showed that 15 of the most politically active nonprofit organizations that generally align with the Democrat Party spent more than $1.5 billion in 2020, hundreds of millions of dollars more than a comparable sample group aligned with the Republican Party. There is a deep bench of well-funded 501c4 organizations aligned with the Democrat Party that expressly support progressive policies and causes. Of course, there are plenty of related organizations on the right as well. The Senate Finance Committee has a long history of oversight into 501c tax-exempt entities and the IRS's treatment of such organizations. Just a few years ago, the committee conducted a 2-year bipartisan investigation into the IRS's inappropriate targeting of 501c3 and 501c4 applications for tax-exempt status. The investigation, which culminated in 2015, found that the IRS grossly mismanaged applications filed by Tea Party and other conservative organizations. The report showed that the IRS improperly disclosed taxpayer information from numerous conservative organizations and that the agency systematically selected conservative organizations for heightened scrutiny in a manner wholly different from how it processed applications from left-leaning organizations. Indeed, the unifying factor for how Tea Party applicants were handled at the IRS was not specific political activities, but rather an underlying political philosophy. Americans, regardless of political affiliation, deserve to have an IRS that will administer the tax code with fairness and integrity and safeguard their private taxpayer information. Regrettably, recent history and current developments show the agency's fallen short. Since last year's massive IRS leak or hack of taxpayer information, which the left-leaning ProPublica obtained and then used to publicize confidential taxpayer details, there has been no meaningful follow-up from the agency or the administration. Perhaps that is because the unauthorized disclosure of private taxpayer data by ProPublica conveniently advanced a preferred political narrative on tax policy. More fundamentally, the apparent leak or hack of private taxpayer information is a serious breach of trust between Americans and their government, and it puts everyday citizens at risk of intimidation and harassment by ideological foes. Americans have a right to know that the personal information they provide to the IRS remains confidential. It will not be used to target them or to advance partisan political agendas. Americans are justifiably concerned about the IRS, or for that matter, any regulatory agency collecting more sensitive taxpayer and donor information than is necessary, and how that collection could impact their lives and their freedom of speech. Policymakers would be wise to heed their concerns. We have an excellent panel before us today. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Thune. I will offer Senator Stabenow the chance to say a few opening words. The bombshell that dropped out of the Supreme Court night before last has put a lot of turbulence into our lives and has caused a lot of unexpected meetings and things to happen. So Senator Stabenow is facing, as a member of Democratic leadership, a lot of activities. I'm delighted that she's here and would like to have her have this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And first, I would say I would hope what would be wonderful that to come out of all the work of this subcommittee would be to recommend that we pass the Disclose Act, which would require basically get rid of dark money on either side by requiring 501c4 groups and super PACs and corporations spending substantial sums in elections to report significant donors. I mean, this is really, transparency is what we really need. I wanted to just take a moment in the opening to bring this to something that beyond elections and so on really impacts all of us, so many people in their daily lives, and just in one area, and that's the cost of medicine, the cost of prescription drugs, and the impact of the pharmaceutical and health products industry right now. We know that they spend $354 million in lobbying. That was what happened last year, far more than any other industry, doubling the spending of the second highest industry. They have enough lobbyists to have about 17 lobbyists for every member of the United States Senate. We know this. But what we don't know is what else is going on. Imagine how much undisclosed money is being spent by the pharmaceutical industry to defeat policies to drive drug prices and healthcare costs down. We know there is much of that going on, but we don't know the numbers on that. And there are well-funded dark money efforts that not only influence or attempt to influence members of Congress, but also each of us in our daily lives. For example, well-funded organizations with innocuous names like the American Chronic Pain Association, Americans for Patient Access, shape the views of doctors and patients when it comes to opioid medications, for example. And there are many, many, many examples of this information going out by groups with names. We don't know who they are. We don't know where the money's coming from. And we all know the tragic consequences in this particular area. These groups were cited in a 2020 Grassley-Wyden report in this committee on opioid industry's use of tax-exempt organizations. So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say thank you for doing this really important hearing today. There are so many ways that this impacts our lives directly and indirectly, and I think it's important that we shine some sunshine on the groups and the money so that we understand what's going on.
It is famously the best disinfectant.
Yes.
Let me now introduce our witnesses. Our first will be Philip Hackney, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh. His scholarship focuses on the tax laws that govern the nonprofit tax-exempt sector, and he brings to us the particular practical experience of having served at the IRS in the office of the Chief Counsel. We will then hear from Bradley Smith, the chairman and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. He is also the Josiah H. Blackmore, Shirley N. Nault Professor of Law at Capital University and previously served as a commissioner and chair of the Federal Election Commission. We will then hear from Ann Ravel. Ms. Ravel served as commissioner of the Federal Election Commission from 2013 to 2017, including time as chair, and she formerly chaired the California Fair Political Practices Commission. She is currently a lecturer on ethics and campaign finance at Berkeley Law School. And our final witness will be Scott Walter, the president of Capital Research Center, who previously served in the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president for domestic policy and was vice president at the Philanthropy Round Table. Mr. Hackney, your full statement will be put into the record, and if you can give us your 5-minute summation, we'd appreciate it very much.
Chair Whitehouse, Ranking Member Thune, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you about the tax laws and IRS enforcement related to the political activities of tax-exempt entities. I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. I specialize in the federal tax treatment of nonprofit organizations. From 2006 to 2011, I worked with the IRS Chief Counsel in DC overseeing the tax-exempt sector. Today, this sector is my research focus. Our overall legal structure for political activities of nonprofits is imperfect, but not bad. It's justifiable. Where we fall down is enforcement. That failure is a combination of a failed IRS budget, but also a failure for the IRS to pursue clear violations. These failures do not favor one party over the other, but favor those interests with the means and the willingness to abuse that legal structure. I want to focus on two fundamental points. First, the IRS budget is not sufficient to ensure the laws are equally and fairly enforced. The 2022 budget improved matters, but there is a hole to dig out from. Second, enforcement. Though the IRS can definitely blame the budget in part on its failure to enforce these laws, there are simple things that it could do to enforce the law that it is not doing. The budget. Congress shrank the IRS budget over the past decade. CBO reports the IRS budget fell by 20% in real dollars between 2010 and 2018. The IRS went from over 94,000 employees in 2010 to about 73,500 employees in 2019. Fewest employees IRS has had since 1970. How has this impacted the exempt organizations group? The workforce shrank from 889 employees in 2010 to around 550 in 2019. As annual exempt organization applications increased, annual rejections decreased. In 2019, with over 101,000 applications for exempt status, 66 rejects. Comparatively, in 2010, with over 65,000 applications, 517 rejects. And what about audits? 2010, IRS data suggests about a 0.38% examination rate. 2019, TIGTA counted that rate 0.13%. While the IRS shrank, the tax-exempt sector grew. In 2010, charitable organizations reported $2.9 trillion in assets, $1.6 trillion in revenue. In 2017, charitable organizations reported over $4.3 trillion in assets and almost $2.3 trillion in revenue. It continues to grow. When compared to the size of the sector, the idea the IRS might be able to use human resource-heavy examinations to ensure compliance is laughable. Enforcement. Efforts such as those recommended by GAO for the IRS to make better use of data available is the only way the IRS in this current environment can make headway against tax abuse. Robust information reporting thus needs to be the norm. Is the IRS using information reporting in the exempt organization sphere dealing with political activities? Unfortunately, it appears the answer to that question is no. First, the IRS recently chose less information, even though it recognizes information reporting matters in stopping tax abuse. The IRS ended the collection of substantial donor information to dark money organizations. That information matters for a range of tax laws, including those that govern political activity. Second, the IRS appears to not make use of relevant public information. CREW documents many occasions where a social welfare organization represents to the FEC that it made independent expenditures, but reports nothing to the IRS. This situation cannot and should not abide. Thank you for inviting me to speak. The tax laws are built fairly well to prohibit the deduction of campaign expenditures, to promote a strong nonprofit sector, and to not subsidize political-related contributions. But the current anemic IRS budget, the lack of enforcement action by the IRS, and the failure to collect substantial donor information from dark money organizations creates a crisis. These factors undermine confidence in the tax system, the equal enforcement of the law, and our ability to operate a fair democratic system. I urge Congress to increase the budget, allow the IRS the ability to properly enforce the laws, but institutionally, I believe the IRS needs to be pushed and given support to enforce these laws. Additionally, I hope Congress considers ending the prohibition on the IRS, enacting sensible rules in this area. It promotes transparency both in government and in the outside and allows folks to know when they're going to step over the line. I believe the IRS can do that now, but these hindrances to the IRS are significant and need to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hackney. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Thune. Under the Internal Revenue Code, a 527 organization exists to influence elections. And under Supreme Court precedents, it is only when that purpose of influencing elections is the major purpose of an organization that it can be required to register as a political committee or PAC under the Federal Election Campaign Act with the full donor disclosure that entails. A 501c3 organization, on the other hand, is precluded from electoral activity as that term is defined by law. There must then be some category for organizations that engage in limited political activity. That is, organizations that do not have a major purpose of influencing elections, but may have a lesser purpose of doing so. And these are primarily 501c4 organizations. C4 organizations are required by statute to be operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. And it has become common in recent years to criticize the IRS because despite this exclusive language, the agency's regulations allow C4s to engage in political activity so long as that is not their primary function. Anything more than a de minimis exception, these people argue, violates the statute. But this line of argument overlooks the fact that the statute does not define social welfare at all, leaving that entirely up to the IRS. There's no serious reason I can think of why social welfare should not include political activity. You have devoted much of your lives to electoral politics and public service, should know that as well as anyone, and I wonder if anyone on the committee would wish to state here today that members, their staffs, and their election campaigns operate contrary to the social welfare of the American people. The IRS regulations say that social welfare does not include political activity, but adds that groups can meet the exclusive requirement if they engage in some political activity as long as they primarily engage in other activities. That's just a roundabout way of recognizing that political activity has to be defined at some level as including a social welfare function, because otherwise, again, there's no spot for groups in America that do not engage in primarily electoral activity, but want to engage in some electoral activity. From a revenue standpoint, C3 charities cost the government money because donors receive a tax deduction. Thus, the government indirectly subsidizes these C3 organizations, and for that reason, Congress has chosen to prohibit C3 organizations from engaging in electoral politics. C4s, on the other hand, have no meaningful impact on revenue, and in fact, they generate tax revenue when they spend money on political campaigns because their campaign spending is then taxed to the lesser of those expenditures or their net investment income. Otherwise, donations are from after-tax dollars. Thus, whether a group is classified as a political committee under Section 527 of the Code or as a social welfare group under 501c4, it has no meaningful effect on federal revenue. And thus, there is no need for the IRS to be investigating these organizations to deny or reclassify their C4 status. If they engage in too much political activity, i.e. it becomes their primary focus, then they are subject to the campaign finance laws and penalties under the Federal Election Campaign Act, which is administered by the bipartisan independent Federal Election Commission. An FEC determination would trigger an automatic reclassification of the group by the IRS to Section 527 organization, but again, this would have no effect on revenue, at least no meaningful effect. This is what the IRS's National Taxpayer Advocate recommended in her report to Congress in 2013, that it, quote, may be advisable to separate political determinations from the function of revenue collection, and the IRS could rely on a determination of political activity from the FEC. Whether one believes the IRS in 2010 to 2012 was targeting conservative groups or merely making a whole bunch of errors, it was not a good thing, and it would not happen if they were removed from this process of trying to determine who was engaged in political activity. Why this ongoing effort to embroil the IRS in the enforcement of political rules? The cynical reason is that some actually want the potential for partisan abuse of the agency, and though this is an inherently abuse of power and almost always harms the IRS revenue collecting mission by sowing public distrust. A more serious but still illegitimate reason is that the desired contributor disclosure would be unconstitutional if done directly under the Federal Election Campaign Act, because Buckley v. Vallejo and other Supreme Court decisions have limited disclosure to organizations that have, again, the major purpose of electing candidates, or to contributions to groups only if those contributions are earmarked for elections. So this attempted end run of the Constitution is bad policy, and as indicated by the phrase end run, it's probably unconstitutional. Let me conclude by noting that, in any case, the problem of so-called dark money is probably much less than it seems. Depending on how one defines it, and there's no legal definition of the term, and people use different definitions, but anyway, you find that between 0.6% and 7.4% of all political spending in the 2020 election cycle was so-called dark money. This is down from approximately 15% back in 2020, or back in 2000, long before Citizens United. Furthermore, most so-called dark money groups, such as the National Association of Realtors and the League of Conservation Voters, are well known to the public. Those that are less well known are hardly unknowable. For example, Majority Forward was the third largest dark money spender in 2020. In less than 10 seconds, a person can do a Google search and learn that, quote, Majority Forward is a Democratic Party-aligned advocacy group that campaigns against Republicans and conservatives. It's literally the first link. You don't even have to click through to read that description. Finally, while the courts have recognized an informational interest in disclosure, that interest is not about helping people to evaluate the quality of an argument, let alone holding people, quote, accountable for their speech. Its sole purpose is to assist voters, and this is as described in Buckley, in predicting the actions of elected officials. Otherwise, this is a limited exception to the general rule that it is not the government's business to investigate or track the memberships, political views, and affiliations of American citizens. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Now we turn, I hope, electronically to Ms. Ravel, Commissioner Ravel.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Thune, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I, too, am honored to be here today to discuss the significance to our democratic process of the issue that this subcommittee is considering. Special tax benefits for nonprofit organizations were enacted by Congress to encourage social welfare organizations to operate exclusively for the promotion of the common good and the general welfare of the community. And an IRS decision subsequently was clear that if an organization is primarily political, it cannot be a 501c4 or 501c6. Federal tax law enforced by the IRS governs the extent to which those organizations may engage in activities supporting candidates without jeopardizing their tax-exempt status, and if such deciding if such activity requires public disclosure or the payment of tax. On the Form 990, expenditures for political purposes must be disclosed, and the IRS can and should remove tax-exempt status from violators of law. Due to the Citizens United decision, lack of enforcement by the IRS and the new IRS rule eliminating donor reporting requirements to the IRS, 501c4s are now a major source of anonymous and very large political contributions. This anonymity has exacerbated dark money, and it's opened the avenue to allow foreign donors to interfere illegally in the United States elections. And it's emboldened 501c4s to violate the law with impunity. In the Citizens United decision, 8 members of the Supreme Court insisted on the importance of disclosure of political contributions, with Justice Kennedy going so far as to say, quote, that citizens with transparency can see whether elected officials are in the pocket of so-called money interests, and also transparency enables the electorate to give proper weight to different speakers and messages. Additionally, and notably, both Citizens United and Buckley versus Vallejo said that a full federal disclosure doesn't impose a chill on speech or expression. Shockingly, and I think this was mentioned, according to the GAO report from February 3rd, 2020, the IRS doesn't even check nonprofit tax records for signs of illegal foreign money in our elections. And the Crew report, also mentioned, recently found that for much of the time since Citizens United, the IRS doesn't revoke Section 501c4 groups' tax-exempt status for violating the law's limits on political spending, partly because they do not even review the FEC filings to assure that politically active 501c4s are consistent and truthful in their filings. Crew reported, as was also mentioned, that groups which had disclosed political spending to the FEC told the IRS under penalty of perjury in their tax returns that they did not engage in any political activity, or else they misrepresented the amount that they spent. The federal agencies such as the FEC, the IRS, and DOJ that have overlapping missions regarding political spending don't work very often together. They do not consult, and I saw this as when I was on the FEC, consult or coordinate information regarding violations of federal law. Congress shouldn't accept this failure to enforce the law that is violated by organizations who do receive special tax benefits that was intended by Congress for social welfare and not as conduits for political spending. The IRS and Treasury Department should update the social welfare regulations to provide clarity around the standard to determine if an organization is operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. To do this, Congress needs to repeal and stop including a rider in must-pass appropriations that has prevented the IRS and Treasury from taking this important step. This dark money rider has kept voters in the dark as to who is behind political spending that influences elections. And the regulations that were enacted decades before Citizens United must be updated to preserve the voters' right to know who is influencing elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ravel. And our final witness is Mr. Walter.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member.
I think you might want to punch your
Sorry. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Thune, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of addressing you and for addressing this critical topic of political activity by tax-exempt groups, which Capital Research Center has studied for decades. I have numerous agreements with the witnesses selected by the chairman. For instance, I agree multiple types of exempt groups must be considered, not just C4, dark money groups, and that groups across the political spectrum, as Ms. Ravel observed, behave similarly. I second Professor Hackney's concerns stated elsewhere about the dangers of elite donors working against the common good. But we have significant disagreements. First, I agree with Professor Smith that donor disclosure is no cure. This supposed remedy presumes that money to a C4, like the chairman's friends at the League of Conservation Voters, is bad if government doesn't coerce the donors into the limelight. But I don't think the League's dark money has captured the chairman. I think he receives it because he and the League have shared views of what the social welfare requires. So disclosure brings little help, but often causes great harm, especially when mobs threaten Americans across the spectrum. That's why the leading constitutional case in this area is one that protected the NAACP in Jim Crow, Alabama. To this day, the NAACP defends donor privacy, as does the ACLU, and the nation's largest LGBT advocacy group. This principle is so important that those left-leaning groups joined with a major Koch-funded group to oppose California's effort to abuse the Schedule B donors list then required on IRS forms. Disclosure is a weapon, as even your witnesses, Mr. Chairman, at the hearing last year where I had the honor to testify, tacitly admitted. They said if I thought the left had more dark money than conservatives, I should want disclosure. Their logic? Donors in the groups they support are hurt by disclosure, so I should seek it to hurt the left. But I do not wish to harm donors and groups I disagree with, and I respectfully urge you to end your campaign to harm donors and groups you disagree with. Another way I disagree with the witnesses today is the excessive emphasis on C4 groups, misplaced for several reasons. First, the supposed threat of foreign intervention. Professor Hackney spins out ingenious possibilities, but is skimpy with actual examples. When I testified to the IRS in its decision to drop Schedule B donor lists for C4s and other groups, I observed how little evidence exists. I despise foreign interference in our elections, but most likely that rarely happens this way because no rational villain abroad would look at our political system and think C4s hold the keys to the kingdom. Look at the money. Statistics can be sliced many ways, but let's take the largest dark money number I can find, the more than $1 billion Ms. Ravel mentioned. She likely was citing a report from the left-leaning Open Secrets, which estimated $1.05 billion in 2020. Open Secrets also gave total election spending as $14.4 billion, so dark money is about 7%. But this ignores the even larger money in the C3 world, raised by groups active in political activity in its broadest sense, as Professor Hackney helpfully puts it. Capital Research Center doesn't have complete 2020 data, but for the 2018 cycle, we estimated public policy C3 money at around $20 billion, compared to around $5 billion for hard political dollars. Dark money is a distant third. We should focus much more on C3s. I'm a Catholic, not a Manichae, so I don't think the political spectrum divides all good on one side, all evil on the other. But alas, abuses among C3s have a strong partisan tilt, leftward toward the Democratic Party. Just this week, Capital Research Center found another example of C3 abuse in a report from Vox, revealing emails from a Democratic super PAC. Writing donors, the super PAC describes the 2020 cycle's, quote, single most effective tactic for ensuring Democratic victories, namely C3 voter registration focused on underrepresented groups in the electorate, close quote. The super PAC even explains the tax advantages. Well-designed C3 voter registration is, on a pre-tax basis, quote, 2 to 5 times more tax effective at netting additional Democratic votes than the tactics that campaigns will invest in. Because 90% of the contributions we are recommending for voter registration and get out the vote efforts will go to C3 organizations and hence are tax deductible, after taxes, such programs are closer to 4 to 10 times more cost effective. They are also eligible recipients of donations from donor-advised funds and private foundations. I ask my fellow witnesses, do we want this in the C3 world? These schemes are the culmination of decades of left-wing C3 voter registration abuse. Liberal reporter Sasha Eisenberg, in his book Victory Lab, describes the Carnegie Foundation's registration and turnout drives, quote, a backdoor approach to ginning up Democratic votes outside the campaign finance laws that applied to candidates, parties, and political action committees. Here, let me apologize for a mistake in my written testimony. I said Karl Rove had not used C3s to do registration and get out the vote, only C4s, but I was wrong. He only used 527 groups and party committees, never C3 or C4 money. Mr. Chairman, let me plead with you to find a way to have the Ford Foundation and its C3 allies rise to the level of Karl Rove's political morality and end their partisan registration work.
Does that conclude your testimony?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Walter. Mr. Hackney, in the wake of the original look at the IRS into the 501c4 abuse, there was a battering that the agency took, a storm of right-wing disapproval by politicians, media outlets, dark money groups, charges to bring criminal referrals against one employee, efforts to impeach the IRS commissioner. Did that storm of abuse have any effect, do you believe, on enforcement motivation within the agency?
I absolutely believe it did. It impacted the way the employees of the IRS feel, the way the institution of the IRS feels. It put both the employees at risk in operating within that space, and it put the mission of the IRS at risk within that space. And I don't think it was fairly done.
Well, the reports afterwards appear to have confirmed that it was not fair, but never mind. We talked about the FEC reporting being inconsistent with the IRS reporting. To your knowledge, has the IRS ever inquired into that discrepancy or asked the Department of Justice to look into whether those discrepancies under oath amounted to false statements?
To my knowledge, from observing outside, I have never seen that take place. I've never seen them move in those ways.
And with respect to foreign use of these dark money avenues, have you ever seen the IRS take any investigative action to explore foreign use of dark money influence channels?
I have not, and I believe Commissioner Rettig recently testified that he does not know of any of that order.
So let's say that we start with the 49.9% and just round it to 50 for sake of doing the math. If you give it to one, let's say you give $8 million. You give it to Organization 1, and Organization 1 can spend $4 million on politics, and then it can give the rest of its money to Organization 2, which, having received $4 million, can then spend $2 million on politics and give the rest of its money to Organization 3, which can then spend $1 million on politics and give the remainder to Organization 4, which can spend $500,000 on politics, and at the end of the day, 93.75% of the money has been spent on politics because of coordination among the groups. And if you really wanted to play your cards right, you could give, let's say, $1 million to each of 5 groups who coordinated to spend half and give the half to the next one, spend half, give half to the next one. You would have a closed circle of spin cycle donations, and at the end of the day, the donor would have achieved the goal of getting 93.75%, actually with 5 it would be another cut, so it would be more like 96% of his money into politics, notwithstanding the 50% restriction. Setting aside the merits of the 50% restriction, which I think is idiotic, Has the IRS ever inquired into some systematic attempts to get around that rule by these sort of spin cycle donations among coordinating entities?
To my knowledge, they have not. I believe it's something that could be attacked, but in this current environment, I don't see it happening. I don't see them having the information to take that kind of situation on.
Ms. Ravel, you've been in the Federal Election Commission seat yourself. You're aware of the concern of foreign money trying to influence our elections. In fact, we've seen Facebook political advertisements paid for, denominated in rubles, which apparently was something that the geniuses at Facebook couldn't figure out was potentially a problem. What should we be doing? How big a risk is foreign money coming through these avenues of influence? And what should we be doing about it?
Take it off mute.
You may still be on mute.
Right, okay.
You're there.
Better. There is a really big risk of foreign money. And I saw it when I was at the Federal Election Commission. We knew that there was foreign money that was being spent as if in these avenues. And despite what people have said about open secrets, while they are a data group, they are very good at analyzing these issues, and they themselves have seen evidence of foreign money coming into the United States elections. And I think it is a huge risk. We know it's illegal. We know that foreign actors are not supposed to have influence on our electoral process. So the failure to have better disclosure in this situation is really significant.
And let me go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. No, I was going to a little bit go off script, if that's okay, and refer to the issue that you asked Mr. Harper, because as the
Mr. Hackney,
chair, yes,
yeah.
as the chair.
Is this about the coordination among groups to defeat the
Yes.
50% limit? Have you actually seen that happening?
I have seen it happen when I was chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. We knew that there was a group, that the Center to Protect Patients' Rights, that was a Koch-related organization. And a lot of their money went to numerous 501c4s. And it was exactly what you described. And so the amount of money that was ultimately spent to influence a ballot measure election was in the millions of dollars. 16 million to be precise.
And to your knowledge, there's never been a single ounce of effort expended by the IRS to inquire into the problem of how a coordinated spin cycle of donations can defeat the 50% exemption, so that actually they all end up spending way more than 50%, but just go through this charade of giving each other the money.
That's correct.
Thank you. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walter, I appreciate your candor in stating that you're, well, many of the C4 groups utilizing donations through the tax-exempt process that you don't align with your political views. Your respect for confidentiality for everyday Americans holds more value to than your political leanings. Could you elaborate on some of the left-aligned, Democrat-aligned organizations that opposed increased donor disclosure proposals, and what concerns have those groups raised?
Certainly, Senator. As I said, the three most important left-wing groups, which have happily worked in court to fight Schedule B disclosure, for instance, which is the donors list on an IRS 990 form, are the NAACP, whose name is enshrined in the leading constitutional case in the whole area, and the ACLU, and the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBT group. And obviously, they believe that their members and their organizations need their donors' privacy respected. And since from the beginning of the Republic, we've had anonymous speech, I think that's not unreasonable.
Mr. Smith, you state in your prepared testimony that the Disclose Act is problematic as both a matter of policy and constitutional law because it would, among other things, focus attention on the individuals and donors associated with the sponsoring organizations rather than on the communications message, exacerbating the politics of personal destruction and further coarsening political discourse. Could you explain a little more in depth what you mean when you say that the Disclose Act will exacerbate the politics of personal destruction and further coarsen political discourse?
One of the problems that has influenced American politics in recent years, I think it's well known to everyone in this room, is the tendency to engage in ad hominem attacks on individuals, overheated rhetoric, and so on. And I think by placing an emphasis on disclosure, and this is leaving aside the constitutional issues, just as a policy matter, this emphasis on who is speaking, who is really speaking, is probably poisonous to our system. I also reject the notion that if, for example, a 501c4 group, the Sierra Club, spends the money, or the Rifle Association spends the money or something, that somehow it's not their money. They're the group spending the money, and it is their money, and unless the donations they've received are earmarked for that, the person who gave them some money no longer has any control over it. So this kind of essential focus on who is speaking, I think, is quite wrong, and it's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court has long protected Americans in their affiliations, in their memberships, and in their political views. And it doesn't only go to joining groups, it has gone to things, all the great cases from the Red Scare of the 1950s, the Hollywood Seven. The effort was to not make it so that people could not speak publicly lest they be blacklisted and blackballed and harassed by people. And that's not good not healthy for our politics.
Mr. Hackney, since last year's massive IRS data leak or hack of private taxpayer information, which the left-leaning ProPublica went on to publicize confidential taxpayer details, there's been no meaningful follow-up from the administration. My Republican colleagues and I on this committee have repeatedly pressed the administration for accountability, and the response has essentially been silence. You're a former IRS employee. How do you think this unauthorized disclosure of private taxpayer information and the total lack of accountability from the administration impacts trust between everyday Americans and the IRS?
So it's a troubling disclosure. We don't know where it came from. I hope there is an investigation into it. So I appreciate that may take some time, and it's a significant matter, and I hope the administration is giving it great care.
Mr. Walter, you write in your prepared statement, and I quote, that no C3 entity should be allowed to fund or execute voter registration and get out the vote, or GOTV. End quote. You further write that failing that, it should be clearly permissible to all, and that uncertainty that surrounds it leads reds to fear the next lowest learner if they dare try it, while blues use fig leaves like civic participation to cover their naked partisanship as they pursue it with gusto. That's a quote. Can you elaborate on that point, particularly as it relates to the political activity of foundations, and what other types of political activity do C3s engaged in?
Thank you, Senator. Well, as I said, and I believe demonstrated rather thoroughly, there is massive C3 voter registration funded by C3 private foundations, conducted by C3 public charities. Now, the governing rule in the IRS world for this is that that sort of thing is permissible only on a nonpartisan basis. And the IRS further spells out that you can't just have the intention not to be partisan in your voter registration and get out the vote. You have to have an effect that's nonpartisan, that does not assist one candidate or party. Well, that sadly is not remotely the case. I quoted you a Democratic super PAC that's gleeful about how this is better than giving money to campaigns. They very clearly say multiple times better, more bang for the buck. There's a most extreme example, I would say, is in the 2020 elections, when one billionaire, Mark Zuckerberg's family, took money out of donor-advised funds at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, gave it to two C3s that were run by C4 Democratic veterans, who then distributed that money to over 2,000 government election offices in almost every state. And as we have been very careful to document, and all our data is publicly available, you can download it and crunch the numbers yourself, that money went with great disproportion to Democrat vote-rich areas, and in those areas made a tremendous difference for the Democratic Party's presidential candidate. So I think this is a serious scandal that needs to be addressed, and I'm certainly not aware of any activity at the IRS to enforce these regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I am informed that Senators Menendez and Warren are trying to get here, so to give them a little bit of time to do that, and with the ranking member's permission, I'll ask about the Trump administration's repeal of the disclosure requirement to the IRS, and what the absence of that information to the IRS does to the ease and fairness of enforcement by the IRS, and particularly with regard to the sort of coordinated network example that I gave. If I could ask Mr. Hackney that first, and then if Ms. Ravel wants to add anything, I'll invite her, and with any luck, Senators Warren or Menendez will be here by then, and if not, I'll give Senator Thune a chance for another question, just in the spirit of fair play, and if none of that has happened, then we'll conclude the hearing.
Thank you. Great question. So this is the Schedule B to the Form 990 that folks file, and the IRS has long requested this information since 1943 or 42. It's requested this information since the form began, and
received it.
And received it. The IRS had kept that in place over 70 some odd years, and then suddenly decided they no longer needed the information. I think they're wrong on that. I think it actually matters to tax collection. I think it matters to ancillary laws. I think it has an enormous impact. One of the things I pointed out in a recent article is there was a prosecution going on in Ohio, and one of the bits of testimony is, hey, by the way, you can get away with bribery today because no one will know whether this thing is happening. It's of significant concern. IRS knows information reporting matters. It collects information from all sorts of folks, from low income, from international transactions, but suddenly in this space it thinks it's okay to turn off the information collection. I think it's going to have a significant problematic effect on the collection of revenue, on the equal enforcement of the laws, and people's belief that the laws are being equally enforced. Because, as I stated in my opening statement, this thing redounds to wealthy interests who are willing to skirt the law. I think it's a problem I hope that they reconsider.
In this space of entities that also enjoy enormous anonymous political influence, kind of interesting that that's the space that gets carved out. Ms. Ravel, did you have anything to add?
No, I think he said it very well, and what it really impairs is an already somewhat dysfunctional process that the IRS has in not identifying those people who are violating the law, and it's impossible for them to it will increase the inability to enforce the law, as was said previously, and I think that is their function. They were meant to do that under the IRS regs, and so that is a really bad idea that unfortunately came about recently to make it difficult for the IRS, even more difficult than it has been to enforce the law.
Thank you. Senator Thune.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, in your prepared testimony, you state that perhaps the most important feature of the FEC's design is its equal size blocks of commissioner with 3 from each party. One of the Democrats' key initiatives in S1, the so-called For the People Act, was to change the structure of the FEC from a 6-member body to a 5-member body subject to and designed for partisan control. Could you explain to the committee why it would be a mistake to restructure the FEC into an agency designed for partisan control?
Sure. We need to understand that the FEC was created in the wake of Watergate and abuses of the IRS by the Nixon administration. And at the time, it was agreed by leaders in both parties in Congress that it was vitally important to avoid that type of executive branch control of an organization that directly regulates political campaigns and political speech. Obviously any agency can have a sort of a partisan bent to the policies it adopts, but they typically are very indirect. You don't have that kind of thing where one agency could just come in and say, no, you Democrats, you can't do that, but you Republicans can. So it was agreed that the agency had to be bipartisan. That was the fundamental point of the agency, the fundamental, issue on which all agreed in setting up the agency. And I note that in the modern era, whenever the FEC is attacked as partisan, the first response of others is to say, takes 4 votes. You have to have a majority that in some degree is bipartisan. And I think that is in fact true. And I think it would very greatly damage the credibility of the FEC to be to have a partisan majority or a single director appointed by the president.
Thank you. We still have people coming, Mr. Chairman?
I can't guarantee it. We have a whole array. We have 28 votes stacked up. And again, we have the repercussions of the Alito hand grenade. So it's a very busy day, and I can't guarantee that anybody else will come. So we will leave the hearing open for 2 weeks. You may get other questions that come in that first week, and we'd be delighted if you'd give us the favor of your responses to those questions. By way of a closing statement, I will say that we have now entered a political era in which dark money groups funded by powerful special interests now, on occasion, actually outspend the political campaigns of the actual candidates. And whatever communication goes on behind the scenes between whoever's behind the outside spending, whether it's a super PAC or a other group, and the candidates themselves is completely unregulated, but the notion that information doesn't travel in politics is an idiotic notion, spectacularly disproved by history. So the idea that there really are firewalls is simply not credible in practical reality. The result of advertisements paid for by entities that don't really exist and that hide whoever it is that really exists, who is behind them, is that there's no accountability for what they say. Hence the degeneration of American political speech and the arising of the phrase tsunami of slime to describe political speech. It was Citizens United itself, a decision that I have violent disagreements with on many angles, but they did say that there is a nexus between secrecy and corruption in politics. And they specifically made that a predicate of the case in order to allow the unlimited money in. Then, of course, that didn't prove true, and they didn't have the chance to rebuild. So repeatedly, I have gone to the Supreme Court to say, hey, you were wrong. You were factually wrong that there will be effective disclosure. I think we're up to how many billions of dollars in dark money spent? $6 billion since that decision, something like that. So there's $6 billion of proof that the Supreme Court got it wrong in its reliance on effective disclosure. And on several occasions, I've gone to the court and said, you got it wrong. On one case, I went in bipartisan fashion with Senator McCain, who was a legendary advocate for honest elections. And in our bipartisan brief, we said, hey, what you said was going to happen isn't happening. You are wrong. You need to correct. And the fact that the Supreme Court never corrected even when the newspapers, the FEC filings, and bipartisan briefs coming into it told them that they had been wrong, I think is a blot on the court. So I intend to continue to work to try to clean up this mess. And just to be clear, the efforts that I will undertake to clean this up will apply to both sides. So the conversation about whether Democrats do better or Republicans do better, whether Democrats are guiltier or Republicans are guiltier, whether who's playing fair or who isn't, it all needs to stop to restore decency and accountability in American politics. And I will note a recent decision in my United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Rhode Island is part of the First Circuit. And a very distinguished Rhode Islander, Judge Bruce Celia, recently just upheld a Rhode Island law requiring disclosure using these very arguments. The Supreme Court declined to review it, and I think that is the argument that makes the better of the case here. We are citizens of the United States, and as citizens of the United States, we have responsibilities. And in order to discharge those responsibilities, we need information. And a very important piece of the information that we require to be good citizens of the United States is who the hell is behind the megaphone that is blaring at us. Because you might very well discover that you can discount the voice once you know who it is. If somebody sets up Rhode Islanders for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity and comes and smears me all over the place in Rhode Island, that's one thing. If it's Marathon Petroleum or Exxon, that's a very different thing. And Rhode Island voters will sort that information out very quickly. In fact, it may be to my advantage to have negative ads run against me in Rhode Island by ExxonMobil. So they hide. And I don't think that's a fair way to go. Senator Menendez has arrived, and I'd be delighted to recognize him for a period of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing as well as keeping it going. For 151 years, the National Rifle Association of America, commonly known as the NRA, has operated as a tax-exempt social welfare organization. In order to receive the privileges of being a tax-exempt organization, namely not paying tax on its revenues, the NRA must follow the same laws that apply to all tax-exempt social welfare organizations. 1, the organization must be focused on its stated mission or primary purpose. 2, the organization's resources must be used to benefit society, not for self-enrichment or private benefit. And 3, the organization must, under penalty of perjury, file annual reports with the IRS showing that they are not violating principles 1 and 2. Since at least 2008, the NRA has repeatedly and frequently violated each of these 3 principles, a trifecta of bad behavior. Their stated primary purpose is to, quote, protect the Second Amendment, promote public safety, provide marksmanship and gun safety training, promote competitive shooting, and improve hunter safety. But in recent years, the organization has spent less than 10% of its budget on this mission. Instead, while mass shootings have ravaged communities across the country, killing 2,500 children and teens each year, the organization became a fear-mongering political media company promoting a lifestyle of loving assault rifles equipped with high-capacity magazines and calling anyone who questioned it socialists who are just simply trying to, quote, take them away. The pinnacle of the NRA's diversion from its stated purpose was its launch of NRA TV in 2016, which had little to do with upholding the Second Amendment. Instead, it pandered in culture war tropes, including calling then-President Obama language that I would not use here, blaming the Manchester Arena bombing on multiculturalism, socialism, and gender bending, and perpetuating former President Trump's deep state conspiracies. The NRA itself, in a suit against its PR company that ran NRA TV, later called this content, quote, a dystopian cultural rant that veered into distasteful and racist territory at a tune of $20 million a year. So my question with that preface, Professor Hackney, with the NRA spending only 10% of its budget on its primary purpose, and instead spending on items like NRA TV warrant close scrutiny, maybe even an investigation by the IRS?
So I've written significantly about the NRA, particularly as the judge was considering dissolving them. I think the NRA is a great example of an organization that shows why we need good regulation in this area. The secrecy promotes corruption. The ability of their folks to operate outside of the light has encouraged significant problematic actions, and the folks who care about the NRA's mission should care about that, so having a good IRS there to do that. I do believe there should be a closer look at the NRA, and I've stated so in news articles before by the IRS.
Well, thank you. Now, let me say the relationship between the NRA and its public relations firm, Ackerman McQueen, who ran NRA TV, is also problematic. The New Yorker, in its expose on the financial dealings of the NRA, describes the relationship between the NRA and its PR firm as, quote, so intertwined that it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The article details overall payments to the public relations firm of $40 million each year, including payments of millions of dollars to figureheads on NRA TV. It also claims that Oliver North, the NRA's president, was paid through Ackerman McQueen. Lastly, it says that, quote, many NRA employees have long suspected Ackerman of inflating the cost of services that it provides. Professor Hackney, if these allegations are true, and the NRA has been paying inflated costs to its PR firm, would this warrant an investigation or even close examination by the IRS? What about the claims that the president of the NRA was paid through an outside contractor?
So I'll focus in on the fact that through that arrangement, there has been a lot of taking of things from the NRA. It's trying to carry out its actual mission, but much money has moved outside of it to people who control the organization, and they've found that it is not appropriate. I believe there should be a closer look at that as a result of those. That is to protect the folks who care about this mission from self-dealing and other acts by those who control the organization.
And finally, if I may, over the past 5 years, the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, has alleged that the NRA diverted millions of dollars from the NRA to pay for its executives' flights on private planes, travel to Africa, Lake Como, the Bahamas, Budapest, designer suits purchased on Rodeo Drive, gifts to friends, memberships at golf clubs, and golden parachute arrangements which included million-dollar mansions and seven-figure salaries. So, Professor, would the NRA spending on these items violate the organization's requirement to protect against private inurement? And if true, does this warrant an investigation or even a closer examination by the IRS?
The Attorney General has put forth substantial allegations that should be taken very seriously. There's been copious reporting in this regard. I think any organization, Democrat, Republican, whatever interest, that engaged in such transactions should have a closer look by the IRS.
I appreciate your insights, and I yield to my distinguished colleague from Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, Senator Menendez, and thank you all for being here. So, giant companies and billionaires are drowning our political system in cash, corrupting our democracy. And a big way they do this is by funneling cash anonymously through so-called dark money groups. These tax-exempt groups don't disclose their donors, even as they spend hundreds of millions of dollars to influence our elections. As the tiniest of guardrails, these groups are supposed to spend less than half of their money on politics, but poor enforcement allows them to get away with a whole lot more than that. Professor Hackney, you not only study these issues as an academic, you spent 5 years at the IRS working on them. So I want to work through just a hypothetical here. Let's say there is an anti-tax billionaire who wants to spend unlimited amounts of cash on an anonymous political campaign to slash IRS funding. An under-resourced IRS will struggle to catch him, even if he cheats on his taxes, and if his dark money groups illegally spend over half their cash on political campaigns, under-resourced IRS not likely to find them. So, Professor Hackney, say one of the billionaires channels millions through one group and then has that group donate over 50% of the cash into another group, which then spends all of it, 100% of it, lobbying against the IRS funding. Does that kind of simple shell game, 1-2, actually trick the IRS into thinking that the first group is apolitical?
Because there's been such little enforcement in this area, I think the only answer is yes. They're not seeing this, and they recently got rid of information regarding that. So I think the answer is yes.
Wow, it's just a huge gap in our enforcement. So we've got this billionaire who can use a simple shell game to trick the IRS. But then this billionaire is also supposed to report political spending to the Federal Elections Commission. Ms. Ravel, I understand you're online with us. You were chair of the FEC, so let's say this billionaire's political nonprofit reports over $15 million in election spending to the FEC. If the same nonprofit told the IRS that it spent less than $10 million on elections, same amount of money, they just give two different reports in two different places, would they get away with it?
Yes, they have been getting away with it. And we've had some conversation about the Crew report that spoke of a number of situations where that has happened, including relating to the NRA, by the way, that we were just talking about. But one of their reports related to in 2018, a federal PAC called Conservative Alliance that ran ads and mail pieces, and they told the FEC about how much money they did it through a Prosperity Alliance of Virginia 501c4 that made political contributions, and the FEC got that information, but they told the IRS on their tax return under penalty of perjury that they hadn't engaged in any political activity and they didn't file a Schedule C report. And then subsequently it happened again, and 78.4% of the nonprofits spent money on political ads and the like again, and also then filed a report with the FEC and failed to file a report on Schedule C with the IRS, and yet said to the IRS that they also, on their 990, that they did not engage in political activity. And the IRS never did anything about that.
Yeah. So what I describe as a hypothetical, you're telling me has not only happened, it's happened repeatedly, basically.
Yeah.
And Mr. Hackney, I see you shaking your head as well. You know, there's a lot we need to do to fix the issue of big money in politics. For one, Congress needs to give the IRS the resources that it needs to go after tax cheating dark money groups and eliminate the appropriations riders that prevent the IRS from clarifying the rules in this area. But while we're working to try to pass some legislation here in Congress, the IRS needs to think about what it can do right now to start shining some light on this ocean of dark money. Professor Hackney, are there steps that the IRS can take right now without a change in the law to stop illegal political spending by nonprofits, such as looking at public FEC data and reinstating high-dollar donor reporting requirements under 501c4 organizations?
I know of no reason that they could not use such publicly, readily available information that the taxpayers themselves have reported. And absolutely, I believe the IRS needs to reinstate the requirement that 501c4 organizations disclose their substantial donors. It makes a big difference in tax collection, and it makes a big difference in our belief that the laws are being equally enforced.
So we need to change the law to give them more tools. We need to fund them to give them more tools, but the IRS needs to step up as well and make pretty basic comparisons like this. You know, there's a lot we need to do to defend our democracy, but the IRS can and should take these concrete steps to limit the role of big money and try to get it out of politics and ensure that government's working for everyone. These billionaires and giant corporations, they think they can buy our elections. And I think it's time to stand up and demand a government that is truly a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you very much for being here. And I now recognize Senator Cortez Masto and virtually hand the gavel to you, Senator Masto.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Thank you. Let me follow up on comments made by Senator Warren. And if Ms. Ravel, let me talk with you about this. So recently, and this is very disturbing to me as a former Attorney General, I read an article in the New York Times, and it's titled, "Donations Steered to Trump Super PAC by Canadian Are Found to Be Illegal." And it describes how a Canadian billionaire helped steer $1.75 million in donations to the America First Action Super PAC. And the FEC found this to be an illegal foreign contribution. They fined this Canadian billionaire, and this is $975,000 this billionaire was fined. It's the largest in the history of the commission. And yet, despite it being illegal, this billionaire may get that $1.75 million back, because as part of the settlement agreement with the FEC, they gave the America First Action PAC the option to return the money to the donor who committed the illegal action, or to donate it to a nonprofit or redirect it to the U.S. Treasury. So this does not make sense to me. And does it make sense to you that a massive illegal donation made to a PAC by a foreign donor, somehow there's the ability to send that money back to that donor instead of disgorging that to the U.S. Treasury and holding them accountable and penalizing them for the illegal activity?
It doesn't make sense, but for the FEC, this was groundbreaking that they were even able to find that there was impropriety there, because it is so difficult to have 4 votes. It seems to me that the FEC, what they should have been doing is potentially uniting with DOJ and utilizing the DOJ criminal division that has the ability, the elections criminal, to look at issues like this and potentially bring some kind of a criminal action. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of connections and conversations between the DOJ and the FEC either on these issues.
Well, let me ask you this, but because it seems to me, even just in the statutory enforcement provisions that the FEC has, just on the fines and the disgorgement, the ability to mandatorily ensure that that money does not get returned back to that donor, and it should be disgorged to the U.S. Treasury as a penalty. Does that require us to change, Congress to change the law to make it mandatory, so there is no discretion to allow this type of return to happen to somebody who violates our very laws here in the United States?
It will take that action, and I think it's important for it to happen, because now that we know, in particular, because this is a foreign donor, it's illegal patently. And so it is something that needs to be looked at by Congress to provide that ability to the FEC.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more. That's why I'm looking at legislation. I just think it is so outrageous that this foreign donor is able to get their funds back. And we do have to hold people accountable and penalize them for violating our laws in this state, particularly when they come to civil fines like this. Do need more transparency and accountability in our campaign finance laws at all levels. So thank you. I am going to yield the remainder of my time. I am not sure if there are any other of my colleagues, either in person in the room, that would like to go next.
Senator, there are no
Yes.
members in the hearing room, so you are free to close the hearing. The record is open for 2 weeks.
All right, thank you. So thank you to the panelists, everybody who joined us today. The record will be open for a 2-week period for any of my colleagues who want to get and submit any additional questions to the panelists. And can't thank you for this so much for this incredible conversation and hearing today. And this committee hearing is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.